The fact is that I don't think anyone's solved that question, and I think the MRV at the moment is very flexible in terms of the different time horizons it uses. So it uses multiple different time horizons, doesn't choose which one you want. The point about the MRV at the moment is just let's get the data. Once we have the data, we can then figure out what we're doing. And those kind of really difficult questions will require a very in-depth discussion and very careful analysis of things like tipping points, things like the accumulation of carbon, potentially some kind of discounting between generations. Maybe there'll be some question of that in future. But at the moment, the thing that's right in front of us is just this MRV is about to have the vast majority of the emissions excluded from the system, and it's not going to be collecting the data it was designed to collect.
Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. I'm Marius, your host, and an engineer passionate about the intersection of aviation, AI, and sustainability. In this episode, we'll explore regulatory aspects around contrail management from an airline's point of view. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting 𝐥𝐢𝐤 Mitchison, a senior policy manager at EasyJet. 𝐥𝐤 represents EasyJet in discussions with the EU and national governments on technical aspects of government policy with a focus on climate regulations. His recent work has been centered on the Fit for 55 package of climate legislations, including the EU SAF's mandate, Refuel EU, and the revision of the EU ETS. 𝐥𝐤's diverse background includes studies in philosophy and economics, followed by policy advisory roles in financial services before joining EasyJet. 𝐥𝐤, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Marius. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, 𝐥𝐤, for being here and bringing this additional perspective into the whole debate or the whole forum of contrail management and sustainable aviation. And of course, we are two human beings talking to each other. So I'm inclined to ask, what is the personal motivation that drives you in your daily job?
I suppose that there's a lot of different aspects to that. I mean, on the one hand, it's fun being very much in the kind of on the leading edge of a lot of technical sort of climate related subjects and kind of being very much involved in the kind of the regulation around that. I find that very interesting. So simply the technical know-how. And the other bit, of course, is that you're doing something quite meaningful and impactful. If you're working in policy for an airline, you are changing regulations in a way that will last long after you've stopped working there and will have a lasting impact on the world. So that's definitely a significant part of my motivation.
Yeah, and this long time horizon is also part of my next question. It's a question that I get asked as well quite often. And it's how realistic is a zero carbon ecosystem in Europe by 2050? So from an economical point of view, can a zero carbon ecosystem be competitive when basically many things need to be reinvented?
It's a great question. I don't think I know the answer, but equally I think that it's an imperative that we try it. I think it certainly is possible. The technological solutions are there, for long and for short haul to fully decarbonize. And once we find viable solutions to the non-carbon emissions, then I think that really does tackle the big bulk of aviation's contributions to climate change. And at that stage, we've sort of solved this problem, and aviation can go back to worrying about the things that they used to worry about before the whole climate change issue came up.
Yeah, and the best step to start is always to look at oneself, right? And you're here representing EasyJet. So what does EasyJet actually do for making their operations more sustainable?
Yeah, so EasyJet in 2022 launched a NetZero roadmap, which basically spells out how we're going to make our operations more sustainable. So it commits us to reducing our emissions intensity, so that's CO2 per passenger per kilometer, by 78% by 2050. And that's versus the 2019 baseline. And essentially, there's a series of levers for how to do this. So one of them is fleet renewal. So it's updating the fleet to burn less. So at the moment, a fifth of our fleet is currently comprised of the NEO aircraft, which are more efficient. Then there's operational efficiencies, which encompasses a whole series of things you can do on the margins to reduce your fuel burn. There's airspace efficiency, which likewise will reduce your fuel burn. Then there's SAF, which is obviously using a fuel that has a lower emissions on a life cycle basis. And then lastly, there are carbon removal reduced to address the residual emissions. And a key component of our roadmap is also the introduction of future aircraft technologies, so zero carbon flight. And our ultimate ambition is to start flying a hydrogen-powered aircraft as soon as it becomes commercially viable.
You mentioned the emissions intensity as part of those goals. What do you think of that goal in contrast to lowering the absolute emissions. How do you feel about this trade-off where one is, the efficiency and the other one is like an absolute measure, because there's also an absolute Earth with, an absolute temperature?
The point of the intensity metric is that you set an intensity which, if everybody in the industry hits it, it will reduce the absolute emissions. So the point of an intensity metric is that if you set the reduction per airline in an absolute term, that in an absolute basis, it becomes far too easy for the laggards who have not actually done anything to reduce emissions, and far too difficult or even impossible for those who are already doing what they need to achieve. So instead, what you do is you take the whole sector, you set an intensity metric, which if everybody hits it, the sector's absolute emissions will drop. And then you tell everyone you have to hit this intensity. And that will reduce the total emissions from the sector, provided obviously everyone's hitting those targets. So it is, I understand, some of the NGOs don't like this intensity thing, but I actually, if you just think through it carefully, you do still need to have intensity targets as a way for the sector to hit overall total absolute reductions in emissions.
I mean, as an engineer, I would say that, if you look at it from a systems engineering point of view, it depends on where you draw the circle. What are the systems where you draw the circles around? And obviously, if you just draw the circle around the Earth, then the more ambitious, you use the word ambitious, the more ambitious metric would probably be the absolute number. But it also has to be possible and achievable. And looking at the absolute impact overall, we also have to take into account the non-CO2 effects. And one of the projects that you're involved with is the Seonia project.
In Seonia, yes. So we're absolutely involved in Seonia, together with a lot of other airlines and parties, including Airbus and Eurocontrol, Météo France, École nationale de l'aviation civile, and DLR, and so on. And we are, so I'm not the technical expert on this, unfortunately David could join, but essentially Seonia is about testing out the potential for operationally avoiding contrail formation by flying around the areas of airspace, so the ISSRs, but first doing it virtually. So you're testing out that you would be able to do the mitigation and doing it all in a virtual setting before you proceed to actually rerouting the aircraft. And that helps you understand, basically, would we be able to do this? What are the various trade-offs and challenges related to rerouting on a large scale, and to understand the implications before you go and actually start moving aircraft.
One important point that you mentioned is the trade-off. It's all a trade-off, and hopefully you have a lot of certainty to do that trade-off. However, it's very likely that to avoid even 80% of the impact of persistent warming contrails, there will be somewhat of a fuel penalty that needs to be paid, a detour that has to be flown. And from the EasyJet perspective, how much of a fuel penalty would you be willing to pay?
Great question. I don't think I can give you just a number like that. I think it's true. We want to avoid, burning more fuel to avoid contrails, or if there is more fuel burnt, that it is the absolute minimum and that we're doing the correct decision in terms of the climate science. So finding out, doing the discounting over time correctly, so that if the non-CO2 effect is time limited and the carbon is there for a very long time, but there's a correct discounting between the two things. And I don't think people have quite figured out what that time horizon is at the moment. So I think it's very hard to say what number would be appropriate, but I think it does make sense. We're trying to decarbonize, so we don't want to have unnecessary carbon being created, but I can't give you a number at this stage.
And beyond the Seonia project, are you already monitoring and reporting the non-CO2 effects of your flights?
I don't think any airline is currently engaging in monitoring and reporting the non-CO2 effects of the flights. So I think there are pilot projects that we're involved in with various other airlines, but there's no sort of wide-scale monitoring or reporting. That's actually what this new EU's non-CO2 MRV is designed to do.
And do you think that this is a lack of knowledge how to do it, or is it more like we don't want to report anything and put ourselves out there, very prominently reporting any numbers without any others doing it?
I mean, there might be an element of that potentially, that you don't want to. I mean, it's common to many issues, is that you need to have a level playing field and everyone playing by the same rules. And if you go out there and expose yourself to some problems or costs that other airlines are not exposed to, you will, over time, due to competition, you will simply lose out. So I think it is important that we do have policy on this. So we do have policy that will gather data. I think that's why it's important that we have this MRV, and that we have the MRV that it gathers the data that it needs to get. But I do think that there is obviously a lot of uncertainty around non-CO2, and that is part of the reason why perhaps the level of science around this isn't as advanced as it is for carbon.
In the tradition of this podcast, I've already slipped in a question from a previous guest, and that was, how much airlines could be willing, to pay to actually fight climate, talking about the fuel penalty. And another question that Professor Manuel Soler asked, in the previous episode, was how would you transfer this kind of surcharge or the premium that's necessary for the detour to the end user? And this nicely leads to the MRV, I suppose, towards also incentivization, etc. So how could you envision, a detour in the future or a fuel penalty to be transferred to the end user? This is not my question. This is Manuel's question.
Yeah, it's a valid question. I mean, one thing you could do is you could make the fuel penalty free. You could just remove the cost for doing it. That could be one way of doing it. There is a lot of discussion about, there's lots of different ways you could do it, but I don't think pricing is necessarily the only way you could get contrail mitigation or non-CO2 abatement introduced in aviation. There could be ways to do with just airspace restriction or something like that would change the way airlines are doing it without applying a direct price. So we're getting a little bit ahead of the horse, because I mean, the first thing we need to do is gather all the data about the non-CO2, figure out where the effects are happening, and then we can make a sensible assessment about how to deal with the problem and what kind of solutions we're going to need. Is it going to be a lot of different solutions for different areas? Is it going to be targeted on a few spaces? Are we going to start with a few really, really big hitting areas, et cetera, et cetera? People jump straight to this pricing idea, and I'm not ruling, you can't rule out a pricing idea, but it doesn't, by any means, it's not the only way of doing it. And actually, if you think about pricing of non-CO2, given that it's very specific in certain times and so on, it could be a tremendously complex way of doing it. There might be other solutions. I think people shouldn't get too lost in this pricing idea. It's one of the ways of doing it, but it's not the only one.
And another way to look at this is obviously through the glasses of the MRV scheme, which is the big topic, and also the ultimate question when it, in all of the discussions that we had so far, it always leads to, okay, now if we had more certainty or, if we had all the data we needed, then how would we regulate this? And this leads to MRV. It would be interesting to hear from your perspective briefly for aviation. What is the MRV and why is it so important in the context of sustainable aviation?
Well, actually, Marius, I'd correct you there, because you've jumped straight into saying the MRV is a mitigation tool. It's not at all. The MRV is just about gathering the data. It's a data collection tool. So the MRV stands for monitoring, reporting, and verification. And although it's been introduced through the ETS directive, and obviously the ETS has carbon pricing elements in other chapters of it, I think people assume that it's all going to be priced in, but that's by no means given at all. I mean, potentially, when we gather all the data on non-CO2, we'll find out that the way to avoid it is just to change the timing of a few flights or fly through a different altitude or different area. It could be very, very minimal. The fact is we don't really know what we're going to do yet because we don't have the data. And so therefore the EU has created this tool which requires airlines to monitor, report, and verify the non-carbon emissions. And that's across the whole breadth of them, in order to gather data that will enable us to decide what to do from a policy perspective. So the tool is really important because it's the only legislative tool that is guaranteed to gather data from airlines. So there's a lot of voluntary stuff going on, like Seonia and so on, which I was talking about earlier. And it's great that this continues and everyone should be encouraged to participate. But the MRV is the tool that's going to actually guarantee that we get data. That's why the MRV is important. And let's not mix it up with the pricing, because the pricing is a whole other question. It's a potential, and it's written into the law. They could potentially price it. But some of the people who are most involved in the climate action aviation themselves are already doubting whether you would really price this. So I think sometimes the pricing is used as a kind of to make people afraid of the MRV, to say, oh, it's going to be priced in, therefore let's not participate in the MRV. The MRV is just about data collection, and then we'll see what to do about the problem.
That totally makes sense. I mean, it all starts with gathering the required data and making data-driven decisions, especially when it comes to such important industries, certainly is the first step to take. And my ultimate question usually in episodes is, when will we have a price tag? When will we have a price tag on non-CO2 mitigation? But like you said, before that, other steps need to be taken. And it's a timeline which we have to respect. And on that timeline, where do we stand right now on the MRV timeline? And is now a critical time?
Absolutely, Mary. So right now, it is a critical time. And, some of your listeners who are involved in the kind of policy debate will maybe have spotted my name or my emails going around about this, but there is a critical time because we're in the legislative process. So the MRV was agreed in December 2022. They agreed a legal text that created the system. But there is a technical regulation called the MRR, the Monitoring Reporting Regulation, that is currently being consulted on, being finalized. And this MRR will essentially spell out all the details of how the MRV will work. And so we're at a crucial point, because although the original text of the MRV stated that it would cover all of European aviation, which is defined as any flight departing from or arriving at an airport located in the European Economic Area, that covers all of European long and short haul. Following pressure from certain parts of the industry, the MRR, the technical regulation, now introduces an artificial distinction and excludes all flights with either departure or arrival outside the EEA from participating in the scheme. So that essentially excludes all of long haul plus a whole bunch of medium haul. That will, just to give you a sense of the magnitude, those flights at the moment account for 75% of EU aviation's carbon emissions. The vast majority of European aviation is actually excluded from the scheme under this new MRR, which limits the scope just to intra-European flights, so just to the short-haul flights. And it's very regrettable, and we really oppose it. So that's us, EasyJet, plus Ryanair, plus Wizz Air, are very opposed to this development. We think it's going to severely undermine the purpose of the MRV, because it's going to exclude the majority of European aviation, A, and two, B, the areas that are most suspected of creating non-CO2 effects. For example, the North Atlantic, which is suspected of creating a lot of warming contrails, it will not have to report any data at all under this MRR for 2 years. So the exemption lasts for 2 years, but of course the risk is that this is just the thin end of the wedge, and then once this exemption is created, it will be extended again and again. We think this is a really negative development, and I've looked through the various arguments for why this needs to happen, and I've spoken to a lot of people, and it seems like you've got the technical people are being told there's a political reason for doing it, and the political reason of being told there's a technical reason for doing it. Actually, there doesn't seem to be any real valid reason for doing it at all. Every argument that's brought up for doing this, if you just look at it very carefully and pick it apart, you can see that there are other ways of dealing with it other than simply excluding all of the extra EA flights from participating altogether. We've been very opposed to this exclusion. It's going to, like I said, severely undermine this whole data collection exercise, and it will misdirect the future policy because we won't have any data on the long haul routes.
For me to understand this properly, you said right now there is a consultation period going on for the MRR, which covers the technicalities and the scope, right, of the data being gathered. And it was planned to have this for all flights, but now they decided to reduce this, or is it more like there are strong voices who want to reduce this? So where do we stand actually?
The amendment originally included long haul, and then, I'm sorry to say it, but IATA and IATA's members and a few other parties have lobbied very, very, very strongly to have all of extra EA flights excluded from it. And then due to pressure, essentially, the Commission has conceded to this and has removed those flights.
Okay, so this is now set in stone already, or is there still some wiggle room within this 1 month?
There is still wiggle room because there's a consultation period, and at the end of that, the member states will vote on the text, will give a yes/no vote. And so there's a potential for member states to still reject this on the basis that it excludes long haul for no particularly good reason. And they could introduce some amendments that will minimize the sort of harm from the exclusion of long haul. And those amendments could be things like, and these are things that we are suggesting. So one of the reasons why they're saying we should exclude all of long haul is that the non-European carriers will refuse to participate. The governments of those carriers outside of Europe will intervene and will cause a fuss and will say, you can't do this to my airline doesn't have to report to you, and if you proceed with this, we will do something else, such as blocking your wine imports or something like that. And so they're basically using this kind of diplomatic pressure. Well, so the answer to that, one answer is clearly to say, well, then the European carriers should still report their extra EA long haul non-CO2 emissions to Europe, while the non-EU carriers could be exempted from it, because that's the current structure they have for carbon emissions. So under 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐤𝐤, the European long haul carriers report their carbon emissions on long haul to Europe, while the non-EU carriers don't. They report it to their own jurisdiction. So why couldn't you just apply the same principle to non-carbon emissions? So you'd still get a significant amount of data from the long haul networks, rather than just carving out the entire network and getting nothing. And the other argument is that, as people will know, the MRV is able to basically, at the click of a button, can auto-generate estimates for any route at all, long or short haul, using publicly available data, flight and weather data, and then default values for things such as the aromatic content of the fuel and so on. And so you could auto-generate those data. And so we're saying, well, look, if any If anyone refuses to submit the data for the MRV because allegedly this is a extra jurisdictional overreach by the EU or for whatever reason, then you just auto-generate the estimates. And then if they want better data, they just have to submit the real data, right? But what we absolutely can't have is no real data submitted, but then on top of that, no auto-generated estimates either. So you just have a completely blank data set for all of long haul, so 75% of Europe's network.
But wouldn't the auto-generated data be able to retrieved even afterwards anyways?
It can't, no, essentially. So someone would be able to potentially get in the back door and produce the data, but you wouldn't be able to publish it and you wouldn't be able to attribute it to any carrier because the ETS report is created by the carrier and sent to the national authority. So the system would have to auto-generate the results for the carrier without the carrier being able to remove them unless they submitted the real data.
Okay.
As the text is currently drafted, no one would be allowed to go in and just create the results for long haul. Or at least if they did, they wouldn't be allowed to publish it, so there wouldn't be any official sort of numbers out there. And if there's no official numbers, there's no incentive to submit the real data.
Yeah, because I was wondering how significant this reduction of scope really is, given the fact that for the calculation or the estimation of the non-CO2 effects, most data comes from observations, which is there already, from other kind of data sources provided by the airlines, some of which are already being provided due to safety reasons. And then the most critical metric that you need is the relative humidity. And that is something airlines can't do anything about that anyways, right? Because the relative humidity is difficult to get as a metric anyway. So is there really the chance that we would lose so much data, or never record it in the first place?
Yes, I think basically, as the text is drafted and as the lobbying is going on currently by parts of the long haul industry, there would be no real data submitted for all of extra air routes, which is 75% of the carbon emissions, so the vast majority of the network. But also they're saying the default values are totally unreliable. We should not be required to generate any default value estimates. So there'll be no real data and no default value estimates. So there'll just be no data.
Okay. And also to get a little bit the angle here, I've been using EasyJet as a customer in the past, of course, but I've only used it in Europe. Just roughly speaking, what is the percentage of short-haul flights out of all of the flights for EasyJet?
I mean, we only do short, medium haul. So we don't do long haul. We don't do wide body. We do some routes to to Israel, to Egypt, and so on.
Mm.
And in terms of for the overall sector, the intra-European flights are 25% of the emissions, but 75% of the flights. So the majority of the flights, but only a quarter of the emissions.
Okay, so this is just the first step, but like you said, it's like the foot in the door strategy, right? If you already lower the scope now, then it's much easier in the future to just remain within that scope.
This is a playbook, and this thing. I've been here now for 5 years, and I've seen exactly the same strategy rolled out over and over again with every piece of climate legislation under the sun. Basically, what happens is Europe will propose a legislation, and then there'll be some technical or political reason why this needs to be restricted to inter-European flights. This happened in Refuel EU, the SAF mandate, where for 2 years there was a very, very long debate, and where IATA and its members lobbied very strongly to have the SAF mandate limited to inter-European flights. And there was all sorts of arguments for why that needed to be the case. The same thing happened with Counter Emissions EU, where there was an attempt to restrict that to inter-European flights. And of course, famously, the EU ETS also is restricted to inter-European flights. It just so happens to be the case that on the inter-European network for IATA's EU members, it's about sort of 15 to 20% of their emissions are intra-EU. So the vast majority of their EU members are excluded by limiting it. And then for the non-EU members, the number is even higher. Make of that what you will, but it seems pretty clearly there's a very strong incentive for everything to be limited to inter-European flights.
Right. And one strong argument is, of course, in all of this, that we want to reduce the climate impact of aviation. And you said that the vast majority of non-CO2 warming, let's say from aviation, would not be covered if the scope was reduced like that. Of course, also there is the commercial interest. You just said that IATA is representing in the vast majority long-haul airlines, and you're rather short-haul airline. So is it fair to say that with this reduction of scope that EasyJet would suffer much more from that?
Yes, because I mean, what will happen is essentially it's like what happened with carbon emissions. There's a kind of a sort of a scapegoating process. So when the ETS carbon reporting scope was restricted in 2012 due to pressure from long haul, and the same mechanism that's happening now, whereby they get their non-EU governments involved and they start threatening action and so on. When that happened, they also limited the scope of the reporting for carbon emissions. So carbon emissions were only reported intra-EA. And then what happens is that for 10 years, everyone just believes that intra-European airlines are causing all the emissions in aviation because you only have the data. You have nothing else to compare it to. If you limit the data collection to a certain point, what happens then is you only have to do something about it within that scope. And so that the risk is that this happens to non-CO2 as well, is that the only data collected will be intra-EA, and therefore the only action will be intra-EA, which is very bad for the climate, but it also is bad for airlines that are covered, because we'll have to do relatively more than if it was shared equally amongst everyone.
But then I'm wondering, some of the members of IATA, they are network providers, right? And they also own smaller short-haul providers as well, right?
Yes, they definitely have a footprint, but I mean, if you look at the numbers in terms of emissions, it's about 15-20%.
And then earlier you said that, I mean, right now there is a lack of staff maybe within airlines. Please correct me if I'm paraphrasing wrongly here, but that there may be a lack of staff when it comes to airlines, of people who look at the non-CO2 problem, right? So it's also about having the respective personnel and the experts to deal with that problem. One argument against this bigger scope is that the airlines will now have to hire people dedicated to that problem, and they could hire people dedicated to other problems, So given that it's a thin margin game already, they now have to put many people on this. What do you think about this?
I mean, look, is it contributing to climate change? Do we have to do something about climate change? I think that's just that's the answer. Is it going to detract from other efforts to reduce our climate impact? I don't know, but we're not going to know the relative value of the carbon versus the non-CO2 until we have the data. And equally, I mean, the cost of the MRV itself and gathering and creating the data is by no means large enough to somehow stop an airline investing in a more efficient aircraft that will reduce their carbon emissions. I mean, the numbers are just nowhere near the same size. So I wouldn't agree with that.
I'm really trying to view this problem from all angles here, as you can tell, right? And another angle is that of the CO2 equivalencies. So it is an open question how to calculate the equivalency, and it comes down to a rather political or even philosophical point, and that is, how long do you want to regulate into the future? How long do you want to look into the future? If you have the global warming potential, which is a metric to compare those two effects, then you can have a 20 years horizon. You could also have a 100-year horizon.
There might be a certain political element to this question of the time discounting between CO2 and non-CO2, because there might be some kind of trade-off between future generations and our generations. At this point, I mean, I think the fact is that I don't think anyone's solved that question, and I think the MRV at the moment is very flexible in terms of the different time horizons it uses. So it uses multiple different time horizons, doesn't choose which one you want. The point about the MRV at the moment is just, let's get the data. Once we have the data, we can then figure out what we're doing. And those kind of really difficult questions will require a very in-depth discussion and very careful analysis of things like tipping points, things like the accumulation of carbon, potentially some kind of discounting between generations. Maybe there'll be some question of that in future. But at the moment, I mean, the thing that's right in front of us is just this MRV is about to have the vast majority of the emissions excluded from the system, and it's not going to be collecting the data it was designed to collect. And I think that's something that we can all perhaps hopefully see the rationale for not doing that.
So what can we now do in order to, within that month, maybe have some positive impact?
People can respond to the public consultation, so they can give their own response to that. Equally, they can speak to their own governments and experts within the environment ministries that are involved with drafting the regulation to just question this whole blanket exclusion of long haul. If there are issues around extraterritoriality and airlines not wanting to participate, there are issues to resolve that do not involve the blanket exclusion of all of long haul. That seems to be excessive. Equally, from what my understanding from speaking to the technical people, there are no technical reasons to exclude long haul, so potentially that just needs to be bottomed out. And when it comes to data accuracy, weather data, and so on, perhaps what we need is just to have wide margins of error for data that's reported on long haul routes if the accuracy isn't there. But people can get involved by basically talking about it, because at the moment what's happening is no one's talking about it. The amendment's just been slipped in behind the scenes, and it's going ahead without anyone even seeming to realize what's happening.
And since you explicitly named IATA in this, there was a report or a proposal being published in April by IATA, and it was co-developed with a couple also of research institutions. So the fact that there are so many research institutions, the logos on the first, page of that report, what do you conclude from that?
Well, I mean, did you read, I think I can't remember pages in the report, the last line, one of the last lines of the executive summary of that report says, the MRV will not produce good data, we shouldn't do this. I mean, it's quite a common tactic in lobbying in general, is that you create reports that demonstrate a lot of technical expertise to get people to trust you. And then somewhere in there, you just kill off the piece of regulation that you don't want to have. And if I was being cynical, I would say that that's perhaps what's going on with that report, because it's a very good report. By all means, the experts are absolutely brilliant, but it's clear that when you just draw the picture of the different positions that are being put together, there's clearly some kind of strategy there. So yeah, the report has a lot of technical expertise, but then it does seem to have this little bit that's targeted at the MRV, and there was something similar. There are other reports produced by various parts of the industry that do something quite similar. And if you stand back and look at the argument, I just don't see how it makes sense that they're saying, well, the science is unclear, we don't know how valuable this data will be, therefore we should not even attempt to collect the data. I mean, if the science is unclear and you're not sure the value of the data, collect it and then just put an error margin or put some disclaimer or something. But the idea that we just should not even collect it at all because we're not sure of the science, I don't see how that follows.
You also said that we should be talking about this more, so I will be talking about this more. And the next guest I will be speaking with is Vincent Meyer from the TU Delft, researching many of the aspects that we spoke about here. And you have the chance to ask a question to Vincent.
Great. My question to Vincent, I think I looked over your biography briefly. Looked like a real expert. I suppose I'd throw him right into the deep end and I'd say, what does he think about this removal of all extra EA routes from disclosing real or estimated data? Would that have any impact? Do you have any views on that at all? Yeah, any thoughts on that would be interesting.
I'm sure he'll like you throwing over that hot topic kind of a question. I will certainly do my part and ask it. And other than that, my part is also to thank you. Thank you very much for being part of this podcast and being part of this forum. You added a perspective that has not yet been here. And I'm pretty sure that the audience will also appreciate some of the insights, how regulation actually works and what is necessary to get to a more sustainable aviation. So, Ewan, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks very much, Marius.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.